Democracy's growing pains. Now there's communism's growing up or growing out pains. The crackdown in China emphasizes that the new breezes of freedom are still encountering stiff resistance, even as more change occurs in Poland and the Soviet Union. What kind of change is in store for Iran is anybody's guess, but the passing of the Ayatollah Khomeini seems unlikely to bring any reversal of anti-Western attitudes anytime soon. Here in the capital, a new speaker has taken command of the House of Representatives, only to be sideswiped by a political assault smacking of a leftover from the '88 presidential campaign of dirty tricks. No tricks from us tonight, just the straight story from Howard Feynman of Newsweek, Georgianne Geyer of Universal Press Syndicate, Charles Cordray of the Baltimore Sun, and Henry Truitt of U.S. News and World Report. Hank, a week of truly staggering developments in the communist world, which now seems to be in a state of convulsion.
Paul, communism is in a parlous state. The events in Poland are such as to almost defy rationality. The solidarity, after many years of struggle, has suddenly emerged as certainly the dominant social force in Poland, and in a position to be the dominant political force were it not for the military. Overwhelming victory in the parliamentary elections, to the point that the Communist Party candidates simply were utterly defeated. Polish voters voted out by denying a 50% majority any number of Communist Party candidates who were even unopposed. So now the party is reduced to trying to seduce solidarity into the government to sort of take a share of the blame for what's going wrong if the economy can't be brought back. In the Soviet Union, the scene in the first meeting of that massive new Congress that Mr. Gorbachev has created would have done credit to the British House of Parliament, not to mention the U.S. Congress, with the shouting and the passionate discourse and the challenges to the leader himself. Now, you must recognize immediately that Mr. Gorbachev is in no trouble so far as running this process is concerned, but he did let them blow off steam, a safety valve, if you will, in this process. But of course,
almost seemed like the U.S. Congress in some ways.
Exactly. The most remarkable developments, of course, were in China, where after weeks of turmoil and student protests and demonstrations, and I think some hope that the government might actually be a bit forthcoming, at least toward granting the minimum student demands. The government cracked down. The hardliners are emerging in control. It turns out that Mr. Deng Xiaoping, who some had hoped would prove to be an ameliorating influence in this process, is claiming credit or at least responsibility for the crackdown. So China has begun to eat its young. They're beginning to sweep up thousands and thousands and thousands of these young people on whom China has to depend if it's going to be a modern nation in the early in the 21st century. Many of the students who are in this country will not be going back. So China is in for a long, dark night, I'm afraid. It's quite ominous.
Hank, is the democracy movement that we were all watching on television with such fascination dead?
Not dead, Howard. I would stick with the argument some of us were making earlier, and that is that China can never return to the status quo ante completely. I think the demonstrations of the last few weeks will have an effect on whatever the government does. In the immediate future, what the government does may be entirely bad, and I think we have to allow for the possibility, after hoping otherwise, that some people are going to be killed in this process. There's still the military problem to be sorted out, because you'll all recall 100 Chinese officers refused to participate in putting down this demonstration, what was a week ago? And that's got to be sorted out. We've seen no disposition on the military relationship. So there's going to be a long period of turmoil, which I think is going to be very difficult to resolve in the context of bringing China back into, to borrow a phrase from the president, in a different context, the family of nations.
But who leads the democracy movement back?
It will have to be done underground and spontaneously and as directed from this country. And I think there will be a great deal of that.
The president said last night that what we want of China is the right to human rights and the right to differences of opinion. It's perfectly clear today that the implication to be drawn from what he said is that we're going to do something more as a country than he has done already.
There's not a great deal he can do that I think will have much bearing on what happens in China, because the Chinese leadership had to have made the decision that it was going to proceed with what is now happening in terms of the larger interest of the leadership. I don't think there's much question about that. And when a government comes to that decision, there's not much outside governments can do. The president was very interesting in his news conference, and he tried to be very careful, and I think he was holding open the possibility that overnight that the reprisals might be less than they now appear to be. And as a matter of fact, I think the administration would say things in much tougher fashion today, as Marvin Fitzwater, the White House spokesman, was doing, referring to them as murderers. The president didn't do that. He was trying to hold open the options, but I think they're losing heart in that regard.
Hank, did the U.S. overplay the China card during these years? There was so much excitement about what was happening.
I don't know, Georgie, and I wouldn't mind your opinion on that, but it seems to me that the excitement was natural. This breakthrough to China by Henry Kissinger, what, 15 years ago, more than that, was such a dramatic event, such a reversal, and we were so fascinated by China that I think the excitement was almost inevitable. In fact, the relationship has developed fairly carefully and was going pretty well in commercial terms and in social terms until this demonstration, this protest movement began to develop, which incidentally I think resulted, or I assume the magnitude it did, as a result of a series of very clearly definable mistakes for the Chinese leadership.
Hank, one of the really interesting things to note, I think, is that the crackdown in China comes at the very moment when you have this remarkable example of a communist government in Poland cooperating with its opponents. When just a few years ago there was a suggestion that any real power given to solidarity in Poland would result in the Soviet troops coming in.
Well, yes, you remember in 1981, solidarity was outlawed, specifically outlawed, and there was some thought that the troops were coming in for a period of several weeks there. It didn't happen.
So the point seems to be that all the ferment taking place now in the communist world is taking place on a variety of levels.
Exactly. But the trend, I think, is clear and consistent.
If China is indeed taking a giant leap backward these days, Charlie, what is the broad meaning that we can draw from that?
Gee, I think, Paul, that the first thing that you can expect is that the United States government and all other governments who had been trying to appraise and assess what was going on in China will have a new assessment to see where they were wrong about the pace and direction of reform. It strikes me, anyway, that you're going to see a collapse of a lot of things that are going on. Money is fleeing from China. Investment will diminish, and Americans are leaving there. Businesses are closing down their offices, and for some time, while the superpowers have both been reasonably cautious, I think that they're going to be asking themselves about Hank's dark age or dark night. I think what's gone on in China may not be unique in a country of thousands of years old. It's awfully hard to find something that's unique, but I think there are unique features to this one, because you have really had an effort to do away with authoritarianism, which is endemic in China, and it has been put down, but I quite agree with Hank, it will not stay down at all. I think that the leadership has undermined its own legitimacy, that it's obviously got to be replaced either in the interim or finally by some people who are not tainted. I mean, you had three struggles going on there. You had the struggle between the students and the urban masses, as it eventually became, and the government. You had the struggle within the leadership, and you had the struggle within the army. And if I could just quote to you what Doak Barnett, who's one of the China students in this town, said: "A little group of octogenarians out of touch with a society became panicky at this pressure from below, which was actually the result of their reforms." And
that's one of the great ironies in this, is Deng Xiaoping
Yes.
really set this process in motion.
Deng Xiaoping used to say that he didn't care whether a cat was white or black so long as it killed mice. And I mean, he went into a market economy away from the ideological stuff, and it got out of hand. You got inflation, you had trouble with wage and price reforms and all that, and so central control came back, the students rose up. This, by the way, we ought to say has been going on for a couple of years. What's new is the crackdown.
But isn't this one of the basic basic threads in what's going on in the communist world today, and that is that when you let the people have at least a little bit of reform, what comes out is a tide of frustrations and resentments leading to demands for many, many more reforms.
Yeah, but you see, it strikes me, I don't know whether I'm right about this, but Gorbachev is doing his reforms from the top, and so he's staying in control. These started from the bottom. I mean, they let a lot of Chinese go abroad and learn things that could be helpful to the society when they came back. They had great economic growth for China. There was a Rand Corporation study that indicated they would overtake the Soviet Union in gross national product by 2010, being the third in the world and all that. So I think there are differences here, but it does come out the same, and that is the communism not working.
As you point out, I think they had gone in China much farther along the route to economic change and economic freedom than the Soviets have yet done.
Yeah, they had perestroika.
Yes, can that genie in China be put back in the bottle, and what's going to happen to the economy there? Because that seems to me could lead to further chaos.
I know, and you're asking me to look into a very murky arena here, and what's going to happen will depend on whether foreign investment continues. And I read one report today that there's, I think it's the figure, $10 billion worth of projects may be put on hold. People lining up at banks to get their money out, and so I think it's going to take a while to shake down. We're going to have to see what kind of government emerges. And as Hank points out, the government that emerges right now is the one that's thrown out the only reformer who was interested in the kids.
You deal with the role of the military in this process, because it seems to me that China's military role, the People's Liberation Army, is in a new position here. I mentioned that this has to be sorted out because of the officers who ducked out in this process, but the Army really holds the wheel now, it seems to me, in a way that it has not in the past.
Two things strike me, and one is that they're going to have to pay off the Army for the help it gave them in this massacre. The Army is fourth in priority in Deng's rejuvenation program, way after, if I remember, going up, it's science, industry, agriculture is at the top. So I think the Army is going to want a bigger slice of the pie for the cooperation it gave. The Liberation Army apparently has been dragged back, maybe it's quite obvious, been dragged back into politics after a decade of trying to make a professional army that was out of politics, has now been politicized. The 38th Army is supposed to be friendly to the Communist Party Secretary General, who is either in or out at the moment.
But the liberal voice.
The liberal. And the 27th is run by Deng and the Yang Shangkun, the president, and various nephews, and for all I know, nieces.
Isn't it almost a form of modern warlordism, Charlie?
The people I've talked to don't think so, because the warlords in the 30s and 40s sort of raised their own armies, collected taxes to run them, and so on. This army is still centrally controlled, and it's politicized again, but I think, once again, where it all comes down depends on who the new leaders are. I assume they're going to be new leaders. Don't you?
And we have to assume, we have to know there will be new leaders in Iran, because the Ayatollah has finally departed. And Gigi, has there ever been a funeral like this one?
What a funeral, Paul, what a funeral. Almost makes you want to pass on. Well, Paul, the Ayatollah Khomeini, the Grand Inquisitor of the 20th century, the man who carried his people from the age of science to the new ages of obedience, and the man that Americans love to hate, finally died this week. We think at about 89. There's always been a question about that. And in death, to be very serious, he brought his suffering people no more.
The National with Knowlton Nash.
Good evening. We now have a few more pieces of the puzzle, a few more answers to the riddle of who is governing China. The country's senior leader, Deng Xiaoping, hadn't been seen since last month. He was rumored to be sick, perhaps even dead. But Deng made a dramatic appearance today on Chinese television to praise the army for last weekend's bloody assault on the student protesters. Deng was surrounded by all the hardliners in the leadership, none of the moderates. There have been fresh troop movements in Beijing, and there are reports that a wave of arrests has begun with students and their supporters rounded up all over the country. Still, there were large protests today in Shanghai, and diplomats say it's impossible to know if the power struggle is really settled for good. Our coverage of today's developments begins with Patrick Brown in Beijing.
Looking remarkably spry for a man who'd been rumored to be dying or dead, Deng Xiaoping reappeared on the country's main television newscast after more than 3 weeks of absence. It was a set piece designed to dispel doubts about his health, about his grip on the reins of power, and about who supports him. Flanked by members of the Old Guard and the Hard Line, Premier Li Peng at his right hand, Deng described the army as China's great wall of iron and steel, and praised its commanders for putting down a counter-revolutionary rebellion. There was a moment's silence as a tribute to soldiers who lost their lives last weekend. No mention of the unarmed protesters who were shot down. The hardline entrenchment at the top is reflected out on the streets, where only a week ago hundreds of thousands shouted their hatred of Deng Xiaoping and Li Peng. A man is identified, chased, and arrested. His offense unknown. Supporters of the pro-democracy movement have good reason to fear a knock on the door in the night. The government has set up a special telephone hotline for informers. Callers are told they'll be rewarded and protected.
我在电视上看到了你们这个通告啊。
The arrests of demonstrators in other cities have been shown several times on television. They're described as hooligans. And yet, outside the capital, the banners of protest are still flying. In Shanghai, tens of thousands of students and workers staged a rally in a city square today.
We are sure that we will win a final victory, although it may mean that we will have to fight for some long time and we may lose some more lives.
In Beijing, there's no defiance as soldiers patrol the city and the cleanup of the debris of a dreadful weekend continues.
Everything that's been done has been done in the name of restoring order and averting a threat to the progress of the past 10 years. What's been achieved is an illusion of public order, concealing the greatest dangers China's faced for 40 years.
Deng Xiaoping's prolonged absence revealed ominous cracks in the country's key institutions, the government, the party, and the army. Also, it's hard to see how he can keep his promises that economic reform and the open door policy will continue, and that the country will now move forward in a more stable, better, and even quicker way. Patrick Brown, CBC News, Beijing.
Even if the leaders of China do manage to fully reestablish their control, there's already been enormous damage done by the events of the past few weeks. Many countries are looking hard at their relations with Beijing. Foreign business people have pulled out, leaving the fate of many projects up in the air. And the tourist business has totally dried up. As Tom Kennedy reports, the relationship between China and the world outside has changed.
When Deng Xiaoping pried open China's closed doors, he did it largely for economic reasons. The allure of an enigmatic society, thousands of years old, was irresistible for tourists who bring in more than $1 billion a year. But the tourists are gone, and the Canadian ambassador does not recommend that they return soon.
Would not. They should stay away.
The other great source of foreign currency here is export-oriented industry, developed with Western capital and expertise. But China no longer looks like such an attractive investment.
Attitudes towards this country have changed irrevocably. The idea of a China governed by a group of benevolent old reformers ended when the first student was killed on Sunday.
When the shocking scenes began being televised around the world, many people's first reaction was revenge. Make the leaders responsible pay. But diplomats here who are advising their governments are saying these images are an aberration.
It is important for people in Canada to remember that there's also the other side. There have been Chinese citizens who have gone out of their way to help Canadians, to be brave, to assist them. There are many, many people in China who still are good, responsible members of the international community.
The carnage of last weekend showed clearly that those who govern this country will fight to retain the primacy of the party and their own position, no matter what the cost. But those leaders are mostly in their late 70s and their 80s. Westerners who try to predict what's going to happen here realize that the old guard does have the army on its side, but the liberal movement has youth,
and sheer determination, which ultimately may have more effect on China's future. Tom Kennedy, CBC News, Beijing.
External Affairs Minister Joe Clark says the brutality against the students has damaged relations between China and Canada and that it can't be business as usual. But Clark also says there are no plans to recall Canada's ambassador. The embassy in Beijing is still helping Canadians to get out of the country. 48 more people arrived in Tokyo today from Shanghai on a charter flight arranged by the Canadian government, and other evacuation flights are planned. Here in Canada, there are about 4,000 Chinese students studying. Some of them have been very active in supporting the protests at home. And in Vancouver today, Prime Minister Mulroney said they don't have to worry about being sent back there, not with the situation the way it is now. Our chief political correspondent, David Halton, reports.
Conversations with him lately.
The Prime Minister canceled an earlier engagement here today to meet with Chinese community representatives and to express his concern over the continuing repression in China. There are 100,000 Chinese Canadians in Vancouver, the largest community of its kind in Canada. All week long, in marches and church vigils, they've been protesting against the crackdown on dissidents in China.
Our protest letter in support of the democratic movement in China.
The message Mulroney wanted to get out here is that Canada's support for those dissidents will be unwavering.
I say to those young heroes, do not despair. Victory must eventually be yours because liberty can never be denied.
Mulroney also discussed how Canada should respond to the situation in China with British Columbia's Premier Bill Vander Zalm. They agreed that family reunification rules should be relaxed to make it easier for both Chinese nationals and Hong Kong Chinese to emigrate to Canada. But Mulroney said Canada's first priority is to provide financial assistance and extended visas to any of the 4,000 or so Chinese students in Canada who choose to stay here.
I gave them the commitment that no one would be returned to China in these circumstances. That kind of hostile environment would be very, very dangerous, and it is something that we would not inflict upon anybody.
Mulroney's officials say the dangerous situation in China is another reason why the government is leaning against taking any new economic sanctions against the Beijing regime. Their concern is that tough new measures at this stage could endanger the safety of those Canadians who haven't yet got out of China. David Halton, CBC News.
In one short week, the city of Beijing has gone from a city of hope to a city under the gun of martial law. Each day it's becoming clearer that the hardliners are tightening their hold on the government and the army is tightening its control of the city. Today there are reports of troop movements and student roundups.
For the people of Beijing, it has been a week of rumors, fear, and defiance. The Journal's Alan Abel went out on the streets and has this report on the mood of Beijing at the end of this extraordinary week.
Tiananmen Square in the heart of Beijing last Friday. And Tiananmen Square today. Deng Xiaoping wanted his square back, whatever the cost, and now he has it. The heart of his capital is a zone of military occupation. And beyond the square, along the broad avenues of the ancient imperial city, his subjects maneuver through the charred remains of a desperate dictatorship.
It's been 5 days now since the massacre at Tiananmen, and the streets of Beijing are still littered with the wreckage of a dream of freedom and the shell of Deng Xiaoping's promise of a better, brighter China.
For the past 5 days, Beijing has been under siege. It was a Chinese invasion of China. The myth of a benevolent people's army had been shattered forever. The troops spread out and dug in and tightened the grip of fear. If you lived in Beijing this week, you watched the troops roll by, and you tried to pull your own life together and survive. They were making noodles in South Chaoyang Alley this week. Longevity noodles. A dish that's supposed to guarantee the diner a long and happy life. That's not a promise anyone on Chaoyang Alley was betting on. Please, she cries, save China, save the Chinese people. We're not safe here. There's nothing we can do, this mother says. She's been off work all week. There's no money coming in. She's frightened for her little girl. She says, of course I'm scared. The police could come and arrest me at any time. After speaking to you like this, I could disappear. South Chaoyang Alley almost had the look of an ordinary weekday. The fruit and vegetable vendors were in place, charging only about double their usual prices. You didn't feel any panic here, no sense of imminent attack. Though people were lining up to buy as many groceries as they could. But beneath the veneer of calm, there was tension and rage. That old woman who lives down there, she saw a small child killed by the army. But the television says that only soldiers were killed and injured. They don't say what happened to the people. If you were watching Chinese television this week, you saw hardly anything you could believe. You saw a group of Chinese journalists taken on a tour of Tiananmen Square, scrubbed clean, they were told, of counter-revolutionary hooligans. Where thousands had marched and hundreds perished for democracy and freedom of the press, the reporters shared biscuits with giggling soldiers, and their leader told China, no one died here, no one died. Night after night, the same relentless message. China's beloved children, out in the schoolyard, active and unthreatened. China's prosperous peasants, down on the bountiful farm. The announcers proclaimed stability and order, an instant rewriting of history to suit the government's needs. But up at Beijing University this week, the students were trying to change that. They were in mourning here for classmates who were gunned down and crushed by tanks. But the survivors fought on. Their wall posters spread the true story of the massacre of Tiananmen. And flyers were being printed to be taken by volunteer couriers deep into the Chinese countryside to tell a gruesome story the official media may never tell. The story of a mad regime that murdered its own children. The student says, we're going to make sure the peasants know what really happened. But while the students were trying to spread the facts, on the streets of Beijing this week, there were more rumors than bicycles. Deng Xiaoping is dead, haven't you heard? Premier Li has been shot, but he survived. Secretary Zhao is under arrest. Civil war is about to begin. They're fighting already in the suburbs. But by the end of the week, there was only one thing you could be sure of. Martial law had taken hold. Infantrymen were on the march through all the downtown districts, scared young men from far corners of China, the city held hostage by country boys. By week's end, the soldiers were cleaning up the city they had invaded. They pretended that clearing out the wreckage could clear away the truth of what they'd done. The buses still weren't rolling, but the propaganda machine was. Over and over you heard it. The soldiers are the people's friends. And the horror of last weekend was all provoked by what the TV news called a handful of bad elements. Meanwhile, at the airport, the foreigners were fleeing in panic. Foreign teachers, foreign students, tourists and businessmen. And you wondered, would the open door slam shut again? How far back would China tumble? No one knows if this week marks the beginning of a new dark era of repression or merely the end of a brief flicker of light. But if you lived in Beijing these past 7 days, you do know that your world has been turned upside down. And you remember your city just 1 week ago and how much hope there was. And most of all, you remember two images. One young man on the boulevard of eternal peace with the courage to halt an army. One young couple in Tiananmen Square as the horror began, waiting, willing to perish for an idea. For the Journal, I'm Alan Abel in Beijing.
That report was hand-carried out of China earlier today because there are still no satellite connections with China. We are joined on the line now from Beijing with Alan Abel. Now, Alan, the story today seems to center on mass arrests of students in Beijing and elsewhere in cities like Shanghai. What do you know about this?
Well, I don't think there's any firm evidence yet, Valerie, for mass arrests. Certainly, if they're going to arrest everyone who protests the stand of the Chinese government, that they're going to have to build jails with millions of cells. There certainly has been television coverage of arrests of a dozen people here, a handful there, in cities as scattered as Canton near the southern coast of China, in Shanghai, where tens of thousands are still protesting almost every day. Certainly there are people who will be rounded up. The internal security apparatus here is enormous. The Chinese proverb is that the net of the law is very wide, but its mesh lets nothing through.
Now, you say under the seeming calm and normalcy in the city that there's a lot of fear and rage in that city. Is there also a sense of tension and electricity that something's going to happen?
I don't think that electricity is crackling through the streets. I think there's certainly a sense that there's a long-term process here that in the immediate few weeks or months is likely to be repression, a crackdown. We're seeing all these television calls for people to turn yourself in, turn your neighbor in. And of course, turning your neighbor in is what this society's been built on for the last 39 years.
Do you think the feeling and the mood of fear, though, is being passed on to foreigners who have become disillusioned with China, having built up links and business connections?
Well, most of the foreigners have left in a very quick, panicky kind of exit, a panic now that in the calm that we're seeing these past couple of days probably was not justified. But Valerie, foreigners and their relationship with China have gone through so many dips and awful periods in this century, from the Boxer Rebellion, the massacre of foreigners at the turn of the century, slaughters of missionaries in the 20s, the communist takeover, the flight from Shanghai in the late 40s, over and over again. We keep coming back to China, and I'm not sure it's easy to explain why. There's some deep compulsion in the Western soul, I guess, to understand this most foreign of nations, most distant, most foreign, most puzzling of nations. And many times before, foreigners have packed up and hastily fled China, and always we've come back.
So you don't think that there would be any long-standing rift because of this, even though you say they physically removed themselves for this week?
I think that being physically removed from China is different from being emotionally removed. And the movement that's gone on here in the last 6 weeks has come so close and touched so many of our sensibilities and convinced so many people in the West that there is a brighter future for China, that this is not something that the outside world, even if they're afraid to be here in the short term, it's not something that we're going to turn our backs on in the long term.
Thanks, Alan.
Thank you.
Now that China's student movement has been at least temporarily crushed, it seems that the wild card in China's future is the army. Both Premier Li Peng and senior leader Deng Xiaoping have appeared on Chinese state television. For many, this is a clear signal that the hardliners are winning the power struggle.
David Shambaugh is a professor of Chinese politics at the University of London. Professor Shambaugh, first we saw Li Peng on television, now Deng Xiaoping. Does this indicate to you that there is unity at the top and that the hardline faction is firmly in control now?
Well, I think it does indicate the hardline faction is in control, but it does not indicate that there's unity at the top. Deng Xiaoping appeared along with about a dozen other senior leaders today. I looked at that tape very carefully, and it's as important who was not there as who was there. Literally half the Politburo were not there. Those that came out, average age was about 83 years old. Clearly the old guard that has gone along with Deng and President Yang and this suppression showed their faces. But I would not say that that adds up to unity.
Do you think it was for show at all, Deng's appearance? I mean, everyone remembers those pictures of Mao swimming. I mean, was it important that they bring Deng out, or?
Well, indeed, it was important. There have been rumors that Deng has died or is dying in the last few days. So just on a symbolic level, it's important. But if you watch that clip carefully, as I did, he had trouble finding words. At least 2 times he had to be prompted for the words to speak to the camera.
And they cut quickly, and the announcer came on and told the audience what it was Deng had said.
Tell me about the people then that you noticed were missing from the pictures. Zhao Ziyang was not there. I mean, people assume that he is out of the picture.
Well, right. He obviously is the most important missing person. The defense minister was noticeably absent. Several other senior military men were noticeably absent. Senior generals and retired marshals were not there. The only moderate who was there is Wan Li, the National People's Congress chairman. Otherwise, the entire moderate wing of the Politburo was absent.
What about Chao Shi, whose name we've heard quite a bit this week?
Well, Chao was indeed there, standing next to Li Peng. This is further evidence that he will probably succeed Zhao as head of the party. And he has been playing an important role in this simply because he controls the internal security apparatus.
Well, the fact that someone would even be able to make that choice to replace Zhao as party secretary, does that indicate then that someone is in control, Li Peng?
Well, I think to the degree that anybody's in control, it's again this old guard. Li Peng and Chao Shi really owe their positions and whatever power they have to the old guard. They do not have independent power bases of their own. So to the degree that anybody's in control, it's that group.
How do you read the heavy military presence in Beijing? And we're hearing that 10% of the Chinese army is in that city alone.
Well, I haven't heard that estimate. It would have been an extraordinary logistical feat to move 10% of the Chinese army to Beijing. But at any given time, 240, 250,000 troops are garrisoned around Beijing. And indeed, they still are around the city. We have reports recently that, in fact, though, the troops in the center of the city are starting to move out to their barracks east of the city now as well.
Well, does it mean to you that they still aren't trusting the citizens in that city, or that the politicians aren't firmly enough in control that they are willing to move the army out?
No, the fact that if they are moving the army out of the city shows that they think they have gained control of the situation. But indeed, the military presence around the city is going to remain for some time to come and on a very high alert status. But we must remember that they're always there.
But certainly, the concern earlier in the week was that the armies might face off against each other. Do you think there is still a threat of that? Are the political leaders in control of the military leaders?
I think the threat has declined. It has not gone away, however. Some deal clearly, to me, seems to have been struck within the military leadership. And the absence of those military leaders I just mentioned at the meeting where Deng appeared indicates that they've either been purged themselves or some deal has been struck with them.
What do you think about the movement of activity to other cities and rebellion in other cities? Can the army deal with that?
Well, this is indeed, I think, the next stage, along with the sweeping purge that we are going to see both within the party and of the intelligentsia in Peking. The Academy of Social Sciences and the universities have already been swept by secret police and military forces. But the action is now going to move to the provinces, and the demonstrations in those large industrial cities will continue, I would estimate. If they are to be suppressed, they will be suppressed by regional military forces, which are not commanded by the same group of the military commission that called in the forces to suppress the Tiananmen demonstrators. And those regional forces come from those regions, and I think that they will be much more reticent to fire upon their compatriots from their provinces.
Do you think that there will be much more of a movement for reform within the party itself? Do you think those people will be purged?
No, I think that indeed they will be purged, and this does not bode well for reform at all. Deng Xiaoping said that the open door will continue and our policies will remain as before. I don't believe that. It's going to presage an ideological crackdown and indeed a purge of many, many party members and dissident intellectuals.
What about the popular struggle for reform?
Well, the popular struggle for reform is unfortunately dependent upon the politics of the nation, and I would expect the workforce to show its discontent with the events of the last 2 weeks in a number of ways. Work stoppages, wildcat strikes, if not actual general strikes in certain areas.
Do you think they'd have the courage to do that?
I do.
And you expect that struggle, the popular struggle for reform in that country, to continue?
Yes, I do. It may not
generate immediately, but indeed it's simply boiling under the surface, and it will not take either very long or much to set it off again.
Thanks for talking to us, Professor Shambo.
Sure.
A final note on China. Last night we reported on efforts by the BBC World Service and the Voice of America to continue broadcasting to China even though their signals are being jammed by the government. Today, Radio Canada International announced that because of the crisis in China, it would begin broadcasting to China in Mandarin, English, and French.
Here for the foreseeable future, at least as long as the current crisis in their homeland continues. That's the word from Prime Minister Brian Mulroney. The Prime Minister says the student visas will be extended when they run out. Mulroney made the promise during a 24-hour visit to the Lower Mainland.
We touched as well upon the question of China, of course.
Late this afternoon at a press conference with Premier Bill Vander Zalm, the Prime Minister made his most definitive statements yet on helping the thousands of Chinese students who are studying in Canada.
Expressed a very serious concern about the some 4,000 or 4,500 Chinese students who are living in Canada or resident in Canada. And a lot of them have appeared on television and expressed their disapproval with what has taken place in China. And those images have gone back to Beijing. And so I gave them the commitment that no one would be returned to China in these circumstances.
China was also on the Prime Minister's mind last night as he addressed 1,200 Tory faithful at a fundraiser.
I say to those young heroes, do not despair. Victory must eventually be yours because liberty can never be denied.
But the response the Chinese community had been hoping for almost became a political nightmare this morning when Mulroney met with business leaders of the local community. The well-heeled group was arranged by Lieutenant Governor David Lam. Reverend Seek-Wai Lo, who arranged the huge vigil Tuesday night, thought he too was invited, but upon arriving was told he would not be part of the group.
My supporters will be very disappointed, and I'm disappointed too.
Who's representing the grassroots up there?
I don't know, because I'm just a newcomer here, and I don't know anything about politics.
Lieutenant Governor Lam stood by his committee.
There are people who belong to the organization to help bring understanding between people, service groups. No, certainly it's not a money group, no.
But Tory organizers sensed bad publicity in the mess-up, and Seek-Wai Lo did get to talk to the Prime Minister for 10 minutes in the hall.
Well, I'm very happy now, because he granted me a chance to meet him. Yeah, that's enough.
But back to the Prime Minister's intended agenda. Mulroney says all the Chinese leaders he has talked to do not favor economic sanctions.
Expressed reservations about any sanctions that might inhibit assistance to ordinary Chinese citizens.
And agree that the Canadian embassy there must remain open. Andy Orr, CBC News, Vancouver.
Most Canadians have managed to get out of China, but at last word, 3 instructors from Caribou College in Kamloops were still trying to reach the airport in Beijing. They had to make a 250-kilometer journey through the northeastern part of the country, and 14 students from Simon Fraser University are on a train heading for the port city of Daylin. From there, they'll fly to Hong Kong. Meanwhile, UBC held a memorial service this afternoon for those slaughtered in Beijing's Tiananmen Square. It was a time for anger, sorrow, and hope.
We were inspired by the courage of our fellow students in China, astonished by the massacre, and still not recovered from anger and grief. Today's student killers will one day be replaced by today's heroes. This day of mourning will be the next democratic government's day of celebration.
We are here, first of all, to condemn one of the most criminal outrages in human history. To condemn a government which has denied its own declared values and the rights of the Chinese people. One of the things we learned from this is no longer to have any more illusions about leaders. What we need to do is to change the whole structure and culture of modern China.
There is only one real revolution: democracy, power to the people, government of the people, by the people, for the people. That's it. Nothing else counts. The situation in China is bad now, to be sure, but I believe there is hope. Hope because millions of people have stood up and protested against the government. I think that's a fundamental.
Officially, 600 today alone in Beijing and at least 8 other cities. And as a curtain of fear descends across the country, the state-controlled media continue their campaign to rewrite history. Roger Smith reports.
The roundup is on. It's a time of terror, intimidation, and knocks in the middle of the night. All over China, hundreds, perhaps thousands of students and workers are being arrested and paraded on state television as a warning to others. The punishment for some could be death. In China, that means a bullet in the back of the head. It's a chilling throwback to the darkness of the Cultural Revolution. The hoodlums and counter-revolutionaries, says the newscaster, must be crushed with the stern fist of the dictatorship of the people. Viewers are relentlessly bombarded with the Chinese version of what happened in Tiananmen Square. They say no civilians were killed. But these photos put the lie to that story. Anyone who was there knows how badly the truth is being twisted. One student leader who has so far escaped arrest sent this description of the massacre through a translator.
I'm Chai Ling, the chief commander of Tiananmen Square. I'm still alive. From June 2nd to June 4th, on the situation at the square, I think I'm the most qualified to talk about it. And it's my responsibility to tell everyone the truth. Students and citizens were being beaten, being hurt. That night, from 8 to 10, the situation got worse. Around us, east and west, Chang'an Avenue had become a river of blood. The executioners were soldiers of the 27th Army. After students left, the tanks and armored personnel carriers flattened the tents with the bodies inside. Then they poured gasoline over the remains and burned them.
This man told a U.S. television network that thousands were killed. The interview was pirated from a satellite feed and broadcast here with orders that people help arrest him for spreading rumors. It's double-edged intimidation. It makes Chinese afraid to talk to reporters, and it makes us reluctant to talk to Chinese, for fear our interviews will be used as evidence against them. Reporters are being openly harassed. The latest victim, a British television producer deported from Shanghai. The attack has also been stepped up on dissident intellectuals like Fang Li-jie. Branded as a traitor, he's been given sanctuary at the U.S. Embassy. The Chinese are furious, but the Americans say they will continue to offer shelter to others.
For humanitarian reasons, we would have to offer temporary refuge.
As the Chinese try to portray Beijing as returning to normal, it seems that the aging leaders may just be buying time. They've clamped an iron lid on a restless population, but they haven't answered the complaints and aspirations that sent millions marching into the streets. The China crisis will keep simmering, and sometime the anger will almost certainly boil over again. Peter?
Roger, how is the crackdown affecting everyday life in Beijing?
Peter, there are soldiers, police, and undercover goon squads combing the streets, and people are terrified. Just one small personal example, I was supposed to meet last night with a Chinese friend who has pretty good contacts, but he called to say it's just too dangerous to talk anymore.
I suppose the challenge for the government now is to extend their crackdown and their control beyond Beijing into the countryside, into the rest of the country. How long do you think it'll take to do that? And do you think eventually that this crackdown will be successful?
Well, it will be in the short term. The government will shut people up by arresting some and bludgeoning the rest with their propaganda. But the word will filter out about what really happened, and people will realize how much blood is on the hands of these leaders. There'll be a kind of passive resistance. People won't work as hard. Foreign investment and tourism are going to dry up. And as the economy suffers, it will only add to the anger and grievances against this government. The most important thing to remember, these hardline leaders are in their 80s, so time is on the side of younger people who want change. Someday they'll get it, but the tragic thing is that the cost is going to be so high that so many people have to die.
Roger, thank you very much. Despite the chilling effect of the government crackdown, students in Shanghai today risked official wrath to keep the pro-democracy movement alive in China's largest city. Alive, but only just. Jerry Bowen of CBS News has that story.
Shanghai University students staged a brief sit-down strike in front of the city's main police station tonight to demand the release of 9 labor leaders arrested for their role in anti-government protest here. The sit-in broke the students' own 48-hour moratorium on demonstrations, which was declared to give the government time to respond to several new demands. Among them, a call for Shanghai television to broadcast the true story of the Beijing massacre. The government response could be heard on loudspeaker trucks roaming the city today. A recording that said only gangsters were in Tiananmen Square, that not even one person was killed by the government. Today's small student protest originated at Fudan University, where a styrofoam Statue of Liberty still stands vigil, and the red banner behind it calls for volunteers to monitor foreign radio broadcasts for the true China story. Other posters warned the students to be careful because the army could still be called in. Indeed, if numbers are any measure, enthusiasm for confrontation is dwindling here, and many student leaders have gone into hiding to avoid arrest. That is why this protest, which wound its way by the old Chairman Mao statue and the new memorial to the students killed in Beijing, was remarkable. But city officials would rather not have the people of Shanghai or the world see even a tiny army of students protesting government policy, which explains why the authorities began confronting journalists today.
The Shanghai police prevented CBS News from following the protesters further under the pretense that our driver had committed a traffic violation. The alleged offense, illegal parking, resulted in the police forcing us to go back to our hotel. It's an indication of the new tough line being taken by the authorities in Shanghai.
China is in the midst of change tonight, changing back to the way it was. Jerry Bowen, CBS News, Shanghai.
And there was a warning today for diplomats and staff at foreign embassies in Beijing. The Chinese Foreign Ministry telephoned several embassies, warning them not to get involved in internal Chinese affairs and telling them to keep staff members off the streets at night. Coming up later in this newscast, more tributes in Canada to those killed in last weekend's Beijing massacre. And the United States takes a tough new stand. The flights were to have been made by Canadian government jetliners, but when Chinese authorities learned they would be flown by armed forces personnel, they refused permission. Protests against the brutal crackdown underway in China continued in several Canadian cities. In Ottawa, about 1,200 people gathered on Parliament Hill today for a vigil in remembrance of the dead students. Alan Fryer has the story.
And now, let us observe 1 minute silence.
They came, they said, to honor the martyrs of Beijing.
Tanks can run over our bodies, they can destroy our bodies, but they can never destroy our desire for democracy.
From Canadian politicians, expressions of solidarity, expressions of outrage.
We are shocked and unable to understand how a country can mow down, can destroy its own children.
The butchers of Beijing must be called to account before the councils of the world.
What do we want? Peace! When do we want it? Now! What do we want? Peace! When do we want it? Now!
And a plea to the Canadian government to do more.
Recall our ambassador. Put the motion before the General Assembly. Grant the students work permits and implement a policy of special refugee status.
Mostly, they stood silent in the light drizzle. The signs they carried spoke of pride and admiration. They spoke of outrage and disdain. The songs they sang were songs of peace.
Our sisters and brothers are in China and they might die.
And you want to help them?
And we want democracy. Because I'm a Chinese. I love my country.
Alan Fryer, CTV News, Ottawa.
There were other memorial services in Toronto, Halifax, and Fredericton. In Toronto, it was the second large vigil at City Hall in as many nights. In Halifax, about 400 students and others participated in a solemn service at Dalhousie University. And in Fredericton, an altar was erected at the University of New Brunswick to honor the students of Beijing who died in last weekend's massacre. In other news, there was a violent confrontation today between students and riot police in Seoul. The fighting began when police tried to crush a student demonstration. Several thousand defiant students marched through the streets, chanting "Down with President No Tai Wu." They battled police with rock.
Democracy students demonstrating in Tiananmen Square, leaving thousands dead and injured. Chinese students here have been watching the television news with horror. Some are filled with dread for friends and relatives back home. Others are terrified because they're here on student visas that'll expire soon. But now the Canadian government has offered them temporary asylum, extending their visas during these troubled times in China. As Tammy Tomlinson reports, the decision brought great relief to the Chinese community.
Expressed a very serious concern about the some 4,000 or 4,500 Chinese students who are living in Canada or resident in Canada. I gave them the commitment that no one would be returned to China.
Those words came just in the nick of time for Li Hongyan. His student visa has run out. He was booked to fly back to China in 6 days. Now he can stay. And every time he reads the newspaper, he finds another reason to be thankful for the reprieve.
Students there and the ordinary people, they're still suffering and they still sacrifice for the democrats. So I feel I'm lucky I'm staying here.
Li will take advantage of his luck. He says he and the 600 other Chinese students in BC intend to help their friends in China from here.
I can write to our friends and to tell them what is happening and what is happening outside, what is reacting of the outside people towards the massacre in Beijing.
Well, we are really happy and overwhelmed with joy.
Reverend Sek Wai Lo was behind the push to grant temporary asylum to the students. He says it was vital.
The Chinese government is now arresting suspects, students, leaders, and if they go home right now, they will be in trouble. Maybe some of them will be arrested at the airport because of showing support for the democratic movement in China.
So Li Hongyan unpacks the luggage he'd packed to go home, a chore he's happy to do. But he says he looks forward to the time he can repack and travel back to a China that is peaceful and democratic. Tammy Tomlinson, CBC News, Vancouver.
There was another protest march against the Chinese government in Vancouver today. About 300 high school students from Hong Kong marched through Chinatown this morning to show their support for students in China. Most of the demonstrators are visa students, many of them joined by Canadian friends. They say the turmoil in China is not just a Chinese issue. It affects every country in the world, and they're worried about what will happen to Hong Kong when China takes over in 1997. Good evening. The Chinese government is intensifying efforts to round up dissidents. Meanwhile, outside China, outrage is growing against the crushing of the pro-democracy movement. Here in Vancouver, there was another impressive demonstration today. Ed Broadbent joined thousands gathered at Main and Terminal. He called on the Mulroney government to do more to stop the Chinese repression. Bill Amos reports.
It begins with a moment of silent tribute to the dead in Tiananmen Square. Once more, thousands gather in what is now almost a daily expression of revulsion at the bloodbath in Beijing. They've all heard that the bloodshed and arrests are still underway, but the speakers try to find some reason for optimism.
In the midst of our sorrow, we should feel excited, on the other hand, because China, all the Chinese have been woken up. In fact, the whole world have come out in support for them.
Ed Broadbent is here too. He says it's good the federal government will now let Chinese students stay here, but he adds that's not enough.
We must speak out and speak out clearly now. Thank you.
The government of Canada must do more. We must withdraw our ambassador to show that through diplomatic message that is well understood, that we don't accept this further step of violence against their own citizens by the government of China, these arrests of students and trade union leaders with the clear threat of death hanging over them.
Broadbent says Canada should sponsor an emergency debate of the UN Security Council, and he says trade sanctions could be a future option. After more speeches and a collection of flowers for the dead to be sent later to the Chinese consulate, the march to Chinatown begins.
Do you think that demonstrations like this are really going to make a difference?
I think so. If people can get together, I think we can make some difference.
It looks like they've won. It looks like the people who champion repression have won.
Yes, but that doesn't mean we have to be silent about it, though. At least we make the world aware of how the people feel.
The movement is not dead.
Of course not. Of course not.
The heart of Chinatown is designated a mourning area, and the protest ends as it began in solemn silence. Bill Amos, CBC News, Vancouver.
They told their story on world television, and now they're being punished on Chinese state television. Pro-democracy students in Beijing are being hunted down by their own government to pay the price for their outspokenness. But as Brian Barron of BBC News reports, even in this terrifying situation, some people are still talking.
The rush to judgment is gathering pace. Nearly every spate of arrests of pro-democracy activists and free trade unionists has a session stage-managed for state television. It seems it can only further damage China's dwindling claims to uphold human rights. The accused are harshly treated as if convicted. Under China's criminal code, prisoners aren't supposed to have their heads shaved until sentenced. But this is more of a heavy-handed political campaign than a judicial process. And the use of state TV has one major purpose: to intimidate the population into accepting the regime's claim that there has been no massacre of unarmed civilians by troops. How extreme the pressure is was shown by the case of this man, an eyewitness to army excesses. Last night, state TV called him a criminal rumormonger and appealed to citizens to find him. Tonight, he was back on state TV, but under arrest and confessing to being a counter-revolutionary. Here, in the west of Peking, the army have established a new makeshift base, though this suburb is supposedly outside the martial law zone. Across the road from the military is Purple Bamboo Park, a tranquil spot for Sunday picnics. It also boasts the one place in revolutionary China where free speech is tolerated without interference. It's called English Corner, and today, despite the massacre a week ago, workers and students were out practicing their English and expressing disquiet.
Many citizens saw the things happened last weekends.
They saw the massacre. Many people saw the massacre.
Yes. Many people saw that.
The military are on top in Peking, and they're so confident of their control, they've opened up Tiananmen Square. The mood is less tense, but resentment and fear is everywhere. Though the gates of the Forbidden City were open for the first time today in nearly a month. Brian
BBC correspondent and his crew had guns pointed to their heads, forced to their knees, and warned not to take any more pictures. To get to Tiananmen Square, it's impossible. You have to fly through many channels, a lot of red tape, and the answer back is no, you cannot go to Tiananmen Square to take pictures. A spokesman told us, if you want to know the truth through the facts, read the People's Daily of 2 days ago.
You said in your report, Jim, that Chinese television were stealing foreign television pictures and using them in their propaganda effort. I gather that that is an intimidation for foreign journalists.
It's certainly intimidating the people here. They're stealing our pictures, CTV pictures, from Hong Kong to Toronto satellite transmissions, pictures taken by cameraman John Koenig and John Jackson. In one instance here, the announcer over our pictures is telling the audience that a tank could not avoid running into a truck carrying soldiers because the students had pushed the truck into the middle of the street and resulting in the death of one soldier who was here to protect and defend the capital.
Thank you, Jim. CTV's Jim Munson in Beijing. People in Vancouver and Montreal today joined thousands of other Canadians who have rallied over the weekend to express solidarity with China's pro-democracy movement. About 500 people marched through Montreal's Chinatown denouncing last weekend's student massacre. In Vancouver, a vigil to mourn the dead students heard speakers, including NDP leader Ed Broadbent, call for tough economic and political sanctions against China. Ottawa has said sanctions will be considered once all Canadians have been evacuated from the country. Most of those remaining are expected to be flown out to Hong Kong by tomorrow.
I gather you both were rather impressed by the Canadian Embassy's effort to get you out of China so quickly.
Yeah, they were great. They helped us. I mean, within 20 hours, I was on a plane back to Canada. I made it home in 15 hours. They were really worried about our group from Seneca, and they just made us feel so comfortable, and they made us feel safe, and I was really, really happy with them.
Libby, you stayed in a woman's home just off Tiananmen Square the night of the massacre, now being denied by the Chinese government authority. When you emerged from that home, tell us what happened and what you saw.
Well, when I came out of the lady's house, the building was completely surrounded by soldiers, and they were lining all the streets. They were just sitting, and it was fairly calm that morning. But as I went through the streets on my way back, it was just terrible. There was bricks all over the streets. There was tanks blown up, cars blown up. There was bottles thrown through windows. There was bricks thrown through windows. There was bloody clothing all over the streets. And you just couldn't deny that there'd been death and there'd been killings and there'd been a war happening that night.
What were you told about what happened as you traveled back to to where you were staying?
Well, when I woke up, the lady told me that hundreds had been killed. When I got back to our university, I had been told that thousands were killed. But then in Beijing, you couldn't find out any information. We were just told this by students who had friends down there, but everybody was denying what was happening. But we knew that there was a lot of killings down there, but the government won't admit to it.
Yeah. Professor Larry, I understand the 27th Army, the Army unit said to have been involved at the square, is a particularly difficult Army group.
Well, I think it's a particularly primitive Army group. It comes from a province to the northwest of Peking. Its members are supposed to be basically very simple, illiterate peasants. They're certainly very young. I should think they were absolutely terrified of the situation they were in. They were clearly very, very poorly trained, because a well-trained army, in fact, would have been able to clear the crowd with very little loss of life. Or what you get reports of again and again is just completely indiscriminate firing. What you also hear about is that them killing a lot of their own soldiers themselves, their tanks running over their own troops, and even by military standards, a total disaster.
Diana, in the 20th century at least, has there been any event that by your note, would match the significance, at least, of what seems to have taken place in the last week?
In the 20th century, no, certainly not in Peking. This, possibly the nearest thing in terms of just a bloodbath would be the Japanese occupation of Nanjing, the former capital, at the beginning of the war. But in terms of Peking, Peking really hasn't known any serious fighting for decades and decades, and this is part of the reason why it's so devastating for the people.
So what is the
there.
significance of that then? What is the significance of the violence that has taken place?
I think it's a sign of a completely bankrupt government, that they have actually, for the first time, certainly since 1949, and even before that for quite a long period, turned on their own people, used their army against their own people. It's just a sign of quite how low they've sunk.
Libby, you must be surprised by the extent to which the government now seems to be going to deny what you know took place. That startled you as a young person?
Yeah, it does, because I heard that the government was trying to cover up, and I heard them saying that nobody had been killed. But what they're doing with the bodies is just piling them up and burning them. And they're never going to have a complete body count. And even once it's all over, the people are just going to be noted as missing. And they'll never have a body count. And I don't understand how they can do this and deny what they're doing and say that nothing's happening. Because it's getting back to Canada, and it's getting back to the States. And, you know, in Beijing, you don't know much. But you come home and you see, you know, you can see more footage on TV, and you know what's happening. And when you walk through the streets, I don't know how they can deny that.
Professor Larry, is it possible to keep the truth as we would perceive it out, given the kinds of communication devices that are available to the Chinese people now?
In two ways, it's not. The first thing that I'd heard already, even before I got back to Peking, people saying, we now consider the truth to be the opposite of what the government says. So if they're talking about a tiny minority, that means the vast majority. If they say no one was killed, that means many people were killed. That's one way. I think the whole population will assume that everything the government says is false, except possibly when you see pictures of an arrest. Obviously something has happened. The other thing is that both the Western media, radio stations, and the Chinese communities abroad are making huge efforts to get information in by any means. They're faxing, they're blind faxing to any fax numbers they can get in China. The Voice of America is going right around the clock on the different airwaves to get information in, assuming that people will try and catch up with it.
But this will take time for any notion of public opinion, as we might to take hold.
Oh, I think the public opinion is there. I think the public opinion is just solidly behind the movement that has just been crushed for the time being.
Thank you both for coming in, and good to see you back home safe and sound.
Thank you.
Yes, and I think we'd both like to thank all the people who got us back.
Especially the embassy.
Attacking the United States for giving refuge to leading dissident Fang Lizhi and his wife. Newspapers accused Fang and his wife of inciting the Tiananmen Square violence and demanded that the U.S. stop harboring them in the American embassy. China also continued to attack Voice of America broadcasts, accusing the U.S. government's shortwave radio network of spreading lies about the military attack on students in Beijing.
This way they get to deny the foreign version, they get to repeat their own version, and they get to at least try to knock VOA down a peg.
The Chinese version is that soldiers were beaten and killed, not students. A revision of history being broadcast over and over on primetime television. Chinese TV showed this ABC News footage, but cut out the following scene showing troops firing and one body being carried away. More arrests were televised, too, in provinces that have never been shown before. It demonstrated that the government is cracking down nationwide, but it also confirmed that the pro-democracy struggle was a nationwide movement. While children were shown singing praises for the army, the government attempted to portray a country getting back to normal. Newscasters said that schools are back in session, that markets are open, that Beijing traffic is flowing again, even through Tiananmen Square. But what the broadcast did not show was this: armored personnel carriers and tanks which continue to protect the square. So the all-out assault on the truth continues, with the Chinese government attempting to convince the people who weren't there that the Beijing massacre was a figment of foreign imagination. Ken Kashwara, ABC News, Beijing.
Well, it's not likely that many foreigners will be impressed, and by demanding the arrest of Fang Lizhi, the Chinese government has increased the tension between the United States and China. ABC's John McCarthy is at the State Department.
The case of dissident Fang Lizhi is now at the top of a growing list of irritants between China and the U.S.
This is a subject which is too sensitive for me to discuss.
In fact, the Chinese ambassador to Washington, Han Shu, met with Secretary of State Baker again today, the third State Department meeting in as many days. Officials say the case of Fan Lejeune dominated the talks. U.S. officials are saying privately that Fan will never be turned over, even if it means allowing him to live in the U.S. Embassy for years. Another point of conflict is the heavy jamming of Voice of America radio broadcasts into the Beijing area. Broadcasts which dispute China's version of what has happened in Beijing.
The whole world has seen what happened in Tiananmen Square. Large numbers of peaceful demonstrators were killed by army units. Labeling such people counter-revolutionaries and hooligans will do nothing to alter the reality of what happened in Tiananmen Square on June 3.
Spokesperson Tutwiler also mildly criticized President Bush's old friend Deng Xiaoping, saying, quote, if the chairman is responsible, then he has acted to undercut the very reforms that he sought to foster. Though the U.S. has now slightly toughened its rhetoric, American officials say no additional steps to penalize China are likely anytime soon. John McWethy, ABC News, the State Department.
Back to Beijing again, another reminder of how in a communist system, he who controls the television system has the tactical advantage. The Chinese Communist Party has not only been using television to rewrite history, it has been using it to track down its enemies. ABC's Jim Laurie in Beijing has been watching what the government is doing.
It is terror in real life. It is terror by television. For the past 4 days, at least 6 hours a day, Chinese TV has broadcast this litany of arrests. Workers, student leaders, union leaders, ruffians they are called, rounded up, handcuffed, beaten, and made to sign confessions. China's hardliners are using television to force their population into silence and submission and causing people to turn on their neighbors. Chinese television shows foreign TV footage of anti-government demonstrations to single out suspects for arrest. This video is frozen, and viewers are asked to turn these people in. When they call the telephone hotline the Security Bureau has set up, as ABC News did, they are told of rewards. Think it over and help us punish the bad elements, they are told. It seems to be working. The most dramatic case involves this interview we conducted a week ago. An angry man complaining about the military's brutality, claiming many thousands were killed. The Chinese intercepted the satellite transmission of the interview from Tokyo to New York. We know because they used much more than the edited version shown on World News Tonight. He was labeled a rumor monger, accused of spreading stories about the Army massacre. A few hours later, the man was apparently arrested. On Chinese TV, he confesses, I know I am guilty of counter-revolutionary activity, he says. Whatever punishment the party may have, I deserve.
The Chinese terror tactics have effectively muzzled the public and caused us to think twice about doing interviews that might endanger those we talk to.
More and more people here back away when approached. We don't know anything about Tiananmen Square, this man says. We also talked about Tiananmen Square with another man. He put his hand over his heart and said, in here I know what happened, but then putting his hand over his mouth, what I will never say. Jim Laurie.
こんな事態をね、容認するだろうかという気がするんですね。そして人民解放軍の中でもですね、もうすでにかなり動揺がありますよね。で、動揺が一方にあると同時に押さえつけろっていう力もありますから、そういう中でひょっとすると内戦の危機さえあると大変なことをやったという気がしますね。まさに中国共産党の崩壊への第一歩じゃない。
All independent student groups have been banned. And the country's borders have been sealed against a possible escape attempt by China's leading dissident, Fan Lejeune, who's now holed up in the American embassy. Canada has decided to step up its protest against the Chinese government. The Canadian ambassador, Earl Drake, is being recalled to Ottawa for consultations. He's been organizing the evacuation of Canadians from China, and most of those who want to leave have now arrived home. We have a report from Tom Kennedy.
The last stragglers began arriving at the embassy this morning, Canadians who had been touring China, or as this man, working here. Most are leaving with regrets and with new insights into this country.
I'm very sad.
for the people here. And I feel that at the moment the Chinese people must be, some of the Chinese people are the bravest people I've ever seen.
So now all Canadians who want to leave China are gone, and like all foreigners who lived and worked in this country, they'll have to decide if they ever want to come back.
For its part, China needs the foreigners who are leaving, who provide currency and expertise for technological and economic development. But good relations with foreign powers are expendable. Total Communist Party control at home is not. Consider the case of the astrophysicist and dissident Feng Lizhi and his wife, identified on national television as traitors. They have been given asylum inside the United States Embassy. China has demanded they be turned over. The Americans refuse. The affair threatens to blow up into a full-scale diplomatic battle. In the meantime, the government continues to crank out volumes of propaganda. The newspapers write about how the army defeated a gang of gangsters and hooligans and how it has restored order. The evening newscasts are totally devoted to the bravery of the People's Army, showing pictures of dignitaries visiting the wounded heroes in hospital. This evening, the coverage lasted more than 2 hours. The propaganda and the images of those arrested have had their effect. Demonstrations have ended. Chinese are now afraid to talk to foreign journalists, who themselves are being intimidated. This BBC journalist was arrested today for the second time.
Officials from the Ministry of Public Security, the secret police, took away our passports and travel documents, and they warned that if we ignore these latest strictures, the consequences will be severe indeed, and we've been forbidden from leaving China.
As the dissident Feng Lizhi told CBC News 2 weeks ago, now is a very dangerous time in China. Tom Kennedy, CBC News, Beijing.
Outside Beijing, there have been scattered reports of demonstrations over the past few days, but most cities are quiet. And in the countryside, most people just seem to want to get on with their lives. Georges Tremel sends this report from China's largest city, Shanghai.
After an initial flurry of demonstrations condemning the violence in Tiananmen Square, Shanghai has returned to normal. The students had delivered an ultimatum to the authorities. The deadline went by without any further demonstrations. The students in Shanghai have not given up on democracy and freedom, but with a sweep of arrests going on right now throughout the country, they have decided that public demonstrations are just too dangerous. They hope to revive the movement when they come back to class in the fall. Some students have said they will fan out across China and spread the message about the pro-democracy movement and the killings in Beijing. It will not be easy. In the countryside outside of Shanghai, the government's propaganda seems to have been effective. People are either convinced or afraid to say otherwise. This farmer says he believes the students' movement was patriotic, but it was eventually manipulated by counter-revolutionaries. That's exactly what the government has been hammering home every day since the bloodbath in Beijing. This other farmer says he does not know anything about it. In fact, in the countryside, many aren't aware of what happened. Outside of Shanghai, most farmers speak Shanghainese, and the government's broadcasts are all in Mandarin. In Shanghai itself, even those who speak English and listen to Western broadcasts and read Western magazines tend to believe the official government line, or at least they are unsure as to who is telling the truth.
For the moment, at least, the government seems to be winning the battle of the minds. And so perhaps with the exception of Beijing, the pro-democracy movement will have a long, hard struggle across the country to win the Chinese people over to its cause.
For the student leaders, they're all